everyone. We are glad to have you back for our next panel, which is legal strategies for reducing gun violence. And we're looking forward to having this panel discuss how law enforcement, investigators, and reporters all work to trace gun violence at its source. And that's going to include the trafficking of firearms, proliferation of ghost guns, and then supply lines for illegal guns and illegal firearms. Moderating today's discussion is Cheryl Thompson. Cheryl is an investigative correspondent for NPR and the senior editor overseeing member station investigations. We're going to drop her full bio into the chat, but I just wanted to highlight that before joining NPR in January 2019, she had spent over 22 years at the Washington Post, where she wrote extensively about law enforcement, political corruption, and guns. She was also a White House correspondent during President Obama's first term. So Cheryl, welcome, and I would like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'd love to introduce our panel for this morning's discussion, which is going to carry over into the afternoon, on guns and legal strategies for reducing gun violence. I'll start with Jennifer. Jennifer Mascia is a senior news writer and founding staffer at The Trace, which is a nonprofit journalism outlet that covers gun violence extensively and exclusively as well. The Trace launched, I believe, in 2015 with funding from Everytown for Gun Safety, a gun control advocacy group. And Jennifer worked with, I believe it was Joe Nacera, she's going to correct me if I'm wrong, at the New York Times to aggregate a daily tally of gun violence victims. The blog was called The Gun Report and started after the Sandy Hook school shootings. Jennifer also authored a memoir about her father's criminal past called Never Tell Our Business to Strangers. I love that title. Next is Chris Munsey. Hey, Chris. Chris is a deputy city attorney in the public rights branch of the LA, not Louisiana, Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. Chris investigates and prosecutes law enforcement actions on behalf of the people of the state of California, particularly in the areas of consumer protection and employee rights. He was his office chief litigator in People versus Polymer 80, a civil enforcement action against the largest manufacturer of ghost guns in this country. Carrie Rossinian is an associate professor, hey Carrie, of public policy at the University of Connecticut and the founding director of UConn's Center for Advancing Research, Methods, and Scholarship in Gun Injury Prevention. She also serves on that state's Commission for Community Gun Violence Intervention and Prevention. Welcome, Rebecca. Rebecca, did I say Rebecca? Carrie. And Esther. Esther Sanchez-Gomez is the litigation director at the Giffords Law Center, which, among other things, tracks and analyzes gun legislation in all 50 states. She also heads the Law Center's Amicus Brief program. So welcome, Esther, and welcome to all of our panelists. And Esther, I'd like to start with you. The Giffords Law Center has led and supported litigation efforts throughout the U.S. aimed at improving gun safety and reducing gun violence. What new pathways have you identified and your center identified that seek to address the, quote, the bad actors in the gun industry?
Thanks, Cheryl, and thank you so much for having me today. For those who noticed that my face wasn't on the first slide, I'm here on behalf of my colleague, Dave Pacino, who wasn't able to be here today, but very happy to talk about this. In the current litigation sphere in gun violence prevention, I think that the main conversation point is really around access to justice laws. These are laws that have passed in a number of states right now in the past year, and basically they create a new avenue for bringing accountability to the gun industry. I think that what's important to remember about gun industry accountability is that the gun industry is not regulated in the way that other industries are regulated, particularly through our litigation spaces. As we all know, litigation is a way to protect against bad actors in spaces where we can't necessarily legislate to fill the gaps. We can sort of anticipate certain bad actions, but we can't anticipate everything that a company might do that's bad, right? And so litigation, across industries is a way to sort of fill the holes when companies or other actors are acting irresponsibly, to curb that kind of behavior by creating incentives not to do it, because the financial ramifications will be high. In the gun industry, there was a law passed, I guess, nearly 20 years ago now, called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And this made it incredibly difficult to sue the gun industry. It's essentially an immunity law. A lot of people compare it to the Communications Decency Act, but it's a really broad law that made it really difficult, sort of in one swoop, to create the kind of accountability for the gun industry that we see in a lot of other spaces. And what states have sort of taken to doing in the last couple of years, and in no small part at the insistence of many of my colleagues on the legislative side, here at Giffords Law Center, is that we've started to encourage states to pass laws that create a bit of sunlight in this broad immunity law, and particularly allow, depending on the state, individuals or the attorneys general's offices of various states to bring accountability lawsuits to the gun industry. The gun industry has been sort of playing by its own rules. It has done an incredibly poor job at self-regulating, which is what it keeps saying it should be allowed to do. And so right now in the litigation space, we're working towards figuring out how to use these laws. They have already been used in some places. New York's law has been used successfully to stop ghost guns being sold in the city in a lawsuit brought by New York City itself. These laws now exist in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, California. There's one being considered in Colorado. I think New Mexico is also, so there's a number of them across the country. And I think we're all just trying to figure out how to effectively leverage these laws, how to get out of the constitutional challenges that have been brought to these laws, primarily by the National Sports Shooting Foundation, a gun industry trade group, and to start to rein in the really irresponsible practices that we've been seeing from the gun industry, particularly in the last 20 years since PLACA, which is the acronym or the shortened form of the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. I'm sure my co-panelists will be using that term in the future, so worth mentioning, particularly since that act passed in Congress.
You mentioned at the start that the gun industry isn't regulated like other industries. Why is that?
Well, so this law that I was mentioning basically sets it outside of this traditional channels that we see sort of, when we think about litigation, we can think about it as its own sort of malleable form of regulation, right? Because it has softer rules. It has rules that, talk about someone being irresponsible, someone being reckless, essentially. And so when we talk about those kinds of rules where it's like, it's not a legislator sitting in a room saying, this is exactly the sort of act that we want to prevent. It's someone harmed someone else with something that they knew was going to harm them. And with litigation, we can protect against those harms by making it incredibly costly to do those acts, right? And that exists in a lot of industries. When we talk about, regulating the car industry and, the advent of a lot of safety features, those were initiated by litigation. Also in the tobacco industry, a lot of the changes that we saw started with litigation. And what the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act did was essentially set the gun industry outside of that. So it prevented us from taking the sort of steps to prevent irresponsible acts by gun industry members.
Okay. Jennifer, you wrote a story in late August on the heels of the dollar store rampage. I believe it was in Jacksonville, it was in Florida, where 3 Black people died, including a father of a toddler and an Uber driver who was killed while dropping off a fare. I believe she was dropping off a fare. Your story examined the gaps in America's gun laws that make it easy for extremists to get firearms. So my question is this isn't the first or the last time we're going to see this kind of gun violence targeting people of color and religious groups. One estimate I read said the guns are used, and I believe it was in your story, are used in various forms of hate crimes like 20 times a day. Talk about those gaps and how we close them. You're muted.
Very few states have laws that address the nexus of hate crimes and, guns. Behavior that doesn't rise to the level of criminality is not going to put somebody in a prohibited database. federally, if you are convicted of a felony hate crime, you cannot possess guns. But what we're seeing is, Facebook pages covered with swastikas, local communities knowing and understanding that there are bad actors among them, but there's nothing in our laws that allows somebody to be disarmed. It really only is when somebody has a tangible mass shooting plot that's discovered that police act, and at that time they do act decisively. We've seen several mass shooting plots, people who are on their way to a location, a school or a church, who have been diverted by law enforcement. At that point, it's taken very seriously. If that intervention does not happen, at that point, we will see what we saw in Jacksonville and in Buffalo. And unfortunately, thoughts, intentions, even social media rantings and ravings are not enough in America to prevent somebody from getting their hands on a gun. And when you make it easy for everybody to get guns, unfortunately, you're making it easy for those type of people to get guns. Social media searches, as part of a gun background check, are only legal in one state, and that's New York, and that was passed after the Buffalo shooting. And that is something that was challenged in the courts and could be challenged in the courts again. And what we're seeing is, since the Supreme Court decision last year, any state that tries to pass a policy that's aimed at this, it seems like a no-brainer. We look at social media for, a job interview is more involved. In some states, you're allowed to look at someone's social media, firefighting departments, police, law enforcement. When you go for a job, they look and see what your social media life is like. It seems strange that America doesn't have something like that, because this is public facing. And, unfortunately, only one state does. And any states that try to pass these laws are going to find themselves in court.
So how do we close the gaps?
Red flag laws are one way. And unfortunately, only 18 states have red flag laws. And that's if somebody is displaying troubling behavior, which could include, racism, a public avowed white supremacy, any kind of intentionality that isn't a tangible plot. A family member in some states, a physician in some states, a school official can tell law enforcement it's a civil process. It is not criminal. So it doesn't leave a mark on your criminal record. This person might be a risk to themselves or others. At that point, the police don't just automatically take a gun. They go in and investigate, and then they bring it to a judge. And the judge decides whether that person should temporarily be separated from firearms. Unfortunately, there are drawbacks. That depends on people in your life basically sounding an alarm, basically, snitching on somebody. And that is not something that a lot of people are comfortable with. It's very hard to come forward with uncomfortable evidence about people that you care about and love. And as we've seen with past mass shootings, that hasn't always happened. And it's because it is very difficult. And also many, many states don't have these laws.
Thanks. Chris, 2 years ago, the city of LA sued Polymer 80, which I believe is a Nevada-based ghost gun manufacturer. And you guys claimed that the company failed to do background checks when selling gun kits. They violated California gun laws and the Federal Gun Control Act. And early this year, I believe it was May, the city won. And now the company is required to do those background checks and put serial numbers on guns. They also can't sell those gun kits in California, which certainly affected their profits. Talk about how this suit came to be. And after that, I have a follow-up for you, Chris.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. And for the question, and for your question, first I should say, in May, we reached an agreement with the defendants to settle the case that then ultimately was reflected in a stipulated judgment that was entered by the court last month. We are very happy with the terms of that judgment. I think it's fair to say we view it as a win, but to be clear on what the outcome of the case was, it did settle before trial. As to your question, I think the sort of simple answer is that ghost guns were clearly a very significant problem in the city of Los Angeles, in California more broadly. as they are sort of across the country. LAPD, I think, was, it's fair to say, prescient in seeing that ghost guns were going to be a large problem. And I think pretty early in the process, started setting up mechanisms to track the numbers of ghost guns that were recovered by the department. And so that process was sort of up and running, which included both setting up tracking mechanisms, training property officers, training patrol officers, training detectives. And that was really the work of the gun unit and the Gang and Narcotics Division. And that was up and running in sort of the beginning of 2020. And what they saw was, sort of very large numbers of ghost guns recovered. It was over 800 in 2020. And understanding that, to the extent there were errors in that process, the errors were going to be low, the numbers were going to be low. Basically, when you're identifying what the manufacturer of a firearm is, whether or not a firearm is a ghost gun, you're going to be looking at the sort of the lower part of the firearm. But you can take a polymer 80 lower and put a Glock slide on it, and if you have someone who's unfamiliar with the process, they might identify that as a Glock firearm as opposed to a polymer 80 firearm, a ghost gun. And so the 800 number in 2020, if anything, was likely low. That went to over 1,900 identified ghost guns recovered by the department in 2021. And out of that, and that's over 20% of the total firearm recoveries by the department. Something like 90% of the ghost guns recovered by LAPD in 2021 were polymer 80 products. And then you saw sort of similar numbers in 2022. So in terms of the volume of the case, very significant. Additionally, there were sort of, large scale incidents, the kind of things that get media attention. So in fall 2020, this is sort of shortly before my office filed the case, 2 Los Angeles sheriff's deputies were just sitting in their patrol car outside of a metro station, and somebody walked up and shot them in the head with it turned out a polymer, I guess I don't have to say allegedly anymore, he was convicted recently, a polymer 80 product. Thankfully they both survived, but that's obviously the kind of thing that makes people take note of the situation. There was a school shooting at Saugus High School with a ghost gun that was not a polymer 80 product, to my knowledge, but sort of the confluence of, in volume, a significant problem, and then sort of significant large-scale incidents, I think made a lot of law enforcement take notice. Certainly became a priority for the department. Chief Moore regularly spoke to its importance to the department as a priority. And then also, I think because of some of the legal challenges that Esther described, PLACA, the case, the opinion was issued after we sued, but the Bruin decision, there may be sort of limited tools to address kind of supply side issues in gun violence, separate from the kind of action we brought.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Bruin in a little bit. And also, I think, was it during a 3-year period beginning in 2020, the LAPD recovered something like 4,200 ghost guns or something? What, I know this is one of these really crazy questions, but I go like, is it legal for manufacturers to sell ghost guns? Because the whole point is you can't trace them, right? They don't have serial numbers. Correct.
So certainly our allegations, which we feel strongly were correct, was that our lawsuit was limited to the ghost gun kits, including what polymer 80 called buy, build, shoot kits, and marketed as a pistol in a box. That's their term, a pistol in a box.
Which you can put together in like an hour, right?
Right, or even less, yeah. There is some work you have to do, milling out the lower, you have to drill holes. But Polymer 80, I think other close gun manufacturers do this too. They provided a what's called a jig. It's like a plastic box that goes over the lower and has like an indicator, a hole in it. It says drill here, and they provide the drill bit. And so you add this all up, and yeah, you could turn these products into functional firearms in, you know, an hour, a couple of hours. And so, yeah, our allegation was that under the Gun Control Act, that meant that these were very clearly firearms. Because the Gun Control Act prohibits not just, you know, a weapon that can expel a projectile, but also one that can be readily converted to expel a projectile. You know, in our view, if you know, an hour, 45 minutes, even a couple of hours is not readily convertible, then honestly nothing is, and the Gun Control Act sort of has no force or impact whatsoever. I think that's particularly true. You know, the Supreme Court has said very clearly, when you're interpreting the Gun Control Act, courts are supposed to take a practical approach and look to the purposes. Why did Congress pass it? And sort of primary right there was to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous people, felons, or people who otherwise shouldn't have them, children, et cetera. And so again, if you're saying that a product that can be turned into a functional firearm in, you know, a lunch break, it is not a firearm for purposes of the Gun Control Act, then it's not clear what work the Gun Control Act is doing at all. But you know, I think in dealing with sort of an emergent technology, which was these polymer frames and receivers, that had not always been the view of the law enforcement community, and that had not the sort of same kind of actions that we took had not always been previously taken.
So why was it important, Chris, and then I'm gonna move on to Carrie, why was it important to address this particular issue within the gun tracing and trafficking pipeline?
Yeah, so I would say to the extent I have expertise here, it is only from, you know, the very good work that the law enforcement in California has done. And so, you know, we in our case, we had witnesses who were LAPD gun detectives. That's all they do is work on guns. Sheriff's Department gun detectives, that's all they do. Cal DOJ special agents, that's all they do. And, you know, they were sort of unanimous. If you are a prohibited person, if you have a felony conviction, a lot of those people want to get firearms. And if you think about it, there's sort of a limited number of ways you can do it, right? And you could steal one, you could break into somebody's house, you could buy one on the street, or, you know, a few years ago, you could take somebody else's email address, set up a new email address, and order a P80 product, maybe have it sent to an address other than yours. There are various mechanisms so that it's not literally being delivered to your front door.
You can do a straw purchase?
Yes, very easily. Or if you're in the business of illegally manufacturing guns, which, you know, certainly people were with Polymer 80 products, that's easier than the sort of prior regime of dealing with traditional firearms. And so if you're in that position and you're trying to get a gun and you're prohibited and you can't walk into a gun store and buy one, you know, breaking into somebody's house to steal a gun, that carries the risk of violence, that carries the risk of potentially being arrested. If you're trying to do a street purchase, you know, it could be that person's trying to roll you. And again, there's the risk of violence. Maybe you're buying from an undercover law enforcement officer. And so the risk attendant to obtaining a firearm from Polymer 80 was significantly lower. And like I said, I have no particular expertise here, except what, I was taught by the gun investigators that we worked with, and they were unanimous that it's significantly more attractive for prohibited persons. It increases the risk to officer safety. If you're executing a warrant, the first thing you do is look up, are there guns in the house? And now obviously it's not the only way to get a gun, and officers are going to be careful no matter what, but it certainly puts you in a position that anyone you have contact with, there's an increased risk that they're going to have a firearm.
Thank you. Carrie, you found that legal strategies and policies are often reactive after violent incidents such as mass shootings. So what type of legal strategies do you think emerge after such incidents, and how effective are they? And as a journalist, I should know better than to ask 2 questions at once. So the first question is, what type of legal strategies emerge after such incidents?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. So I think it's important to maybe just back up a second and talk briefly about the sort of landscape or composition of gun deaths in America. Right, we've had nearly 48,000 gun deaths last year in 2022. About 56% of those were suicide. And so in some statistics, those aren't classified as gun violence because there's not a victim perpetrator dyad. Homicides include about 41% of gun deaths, and about 0.1% of those are mass shootings, as defined by the FBI. And then the remaining 3% can be unintentional legal intervention, undetermined, right? There's just sort of, those are the main sort of other categories. So you're absolutely right. We do, well, and other colleagues, I should say, have found that often in response to what is sometimes called a firearm focusing event, policies are enacted to try to deal with the epidemic of gun violence. Sometimes this is after a mass shooting, sometimes it's not, but mass shootings tend to capture our national attention in ways that other shootings do not. And so therefore they become this focusing event. So sort of high profile examples of those include the tragedy at Sandy Hook a little over 10 years ago. While that did not result in sort of meaningful national legislation, it did result in state legislation. The Las Vegas concert shooting in 2017, again, didn't result in sort of congressional legislative action, but it did result in the banning of bump stocks by President Trump. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting in Florida led to sort of a host of statutes at the Florida level, one of which was the enactment of ERPOs, which Jennifer talked about earlier, emergency risk protective orders, sometimes called red flag laws. And then, of course, I think the sort of biggest example that we have recently is the just horrific tragedy that happened at Uvalde in Texas, which culminated in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the has been hailed as the largest federal gun legislation in 30 years. So that legislation had 6 components. And, to answer your question about what is effective, I think some of these we know are effective, and some of them are things that are sort of new and emerging and are understudied, or are new things, right? So I want to put that caveat on them. So one is to support state crisis intervention orders, which is ERPOs, and to provide states with about $750 million of funding to do that. One is protections for victims of domestic violence. We've seen in other areas that reducing domestic violence and placing restrictions on domestic violence offenders can be incredibly effective at reducing not just domestic violence shootings, but potentially mass shootings as well, given the overlap between domestic violence and mass shootings. Clarified definition of the federally licensed firearm dealer. That goes a lot to what Chris was saying and to Esther's original points. the under 21 enhanced review process. So really looking at younger gun purchasers and really thinking about, is there something in the record that we would want to really sort of give this person extra scrutiny? Penalties for straw purchasing, again, goes to Chris's comments, and violence interruption funding, which I know there were several panels about the efficacy of those efforts yesterday, so which were incredible. And I encourage people to go back and view them, and increased funding of about $250 million. Many of those aren't statutes in the way that we currently think about them, right? They're sort of increased funding to incentivize states to either enact a law or to strengthen existing laws, the ERPO legislation being the primary one. And ERPO legislation is relatively new. Connecticut has had an ERPO law for decades following the Connecticut lottery shooting, but many states have been adopting those more recently. And so the evidence is sort of new and emerging there. What we do know is those red flag laws tend to be used in cases, well, they tend to be granted about 85% of the time. They are granted, and they tend to have some kind of interpersonal violence underneath them, right? And a concern about suicide, that the person is an imminent danger to themselves, family violence, and sometimes mass shooting events. And I should say those statistics are limited to the states where those laws are in place and that were studied, which is a finite group and could be a select sample. So I don't know that those statistics are generalizable.
Mm-hmm. I'm
Do
sorry.
you want me to answer the second part of your question, which
That's
is?
what I was going to say. I think you kind of did
Okay.
a little bit, but I have another question for you. So I heard you tick off the legislation around the country after these mass shootings, the kinds of things that emerge. Why do we continue to have them if these strategies and these, things are so effective?
Oh, well, because there are more guns than people in the United States. There are more guns than people. There are guns that we know about. There are guns that we don't know about. And strategies are only as effective as they are sort of enforced and implemented. So even with background checks are effective. However, there are loopholes in that process. And, just under half of all guns are acquired outside of background checks. You and Chris just had a conversation about that. And so they can prevent only to the extent that they are adopted and implemented. And we don't do a really good job at thinking about who has guns in the United States, right? And we really need to think a lot about who has guns and making concerted efforts to ensure that people who are dangerous to themselves and others do not have guns. And that's not just at the point of sale. I think the other part is many of our laws really think about point of sale, background checks being like a sort of obvious example. We check the purchaser at the time of sale, but then there's no sort of concerted follow-up unless there's a red flag. And then depending on the state's law, there may be an ERPO case or investigation. And so we don't do a good job at follow through. And we need to really, but I have to get my license for my car regularly updated. I have to re-register my car regularly. Lots of things happen in other spaces that we don't place on sort of thinking about whether or not a person is safe to have a gun, either for themselves or for those around them. The final thing I want to say, Cheryl, is that any gun legislation can be effective. Just like any reading intervention can be effective. That doesn't mean if you implement the intervention or the law, every problem will magically be solved. Gun violence and gun death and gun injury is a very diverse topic that influences lots of different communities. And pardon the pun, but there's no silver bullet. And so what we need is a range. What we need is a range of responses, not just a few, to really think about creating a true and robust strategy to ensure that gun owners can continue to own guns in accordance with their Second Amendment rights, and that I can continue to live my life, which I also own guns, right? That I can continue to live my life in a safe way as I venture throughout society, right? So I think we have to figure out how to make these two things to work together. And unfortunately, sometimes we think about these in very polarized ways or only in response to very rare events, which is what a mass shooting is, when we need to be thinking much more broadly.
You know, it's odd. I went to the grocery store the other day. This is an aside, and I get in the parking lot to where I always shop, and it's a senior. I don't live there, but it's a senior community, and it's very, you know, Jewish, older people, probably higher end. You know, they probably did well in life, and I get there, and there's all these police. I mean, the place is swarming with police in the parking lot. I'm like, what is going on? So I get out of my car, of course, the reporter and me, and this woman is shaking. She wasn't a senior, she was shaking. And I said, what happened? She said, a guy came in with a gun into the grocery store and started waving it. She said, and we all just ran for cover. I ran in the freezer, and I'm thinking, they got him, but I thought, what's to stop this guy from coming back another day and really doing harm? Right? Because, you know, I don't know who he was. Somebody said he was an older guy. I don't know. But what's to stop him from coming back? So my question to Esther is, what strategies that Rebecca, what do I want to call Carrie Rebecca, that Carrie was talking about and others.
I like Rebecca very much, so I'll take that as a compliment. You can
You
call me
know,
Rebecca, totally fine.
They don't even have the same amount of syllables. Okay. What strategies have proven most effective after lives have been lost to gun violence?
So I think Carrie touched on this a bit, which is basically there are a lot of different policies that have been proven to be effective. And, you know, it's really about a collection of those policies, because the world that we exist in with so many firearms out in communities, and the easy access to those firearms, both through legal and illegal means, makes it such that we need to approach this problem from a lot of different angles. But a lot of the different policies that my organization advocates for, and that Carrie was talking about and Jennifer was talking about, they have been proven, you know, through social science research to be effective at reducing gun violence in communities. You know, we talk about, he talked about this man entering a grocery store. When we talk about people having to be licensed to carry firearms in public spaces, robust licensing laws do reduce gun violence in those communities. And they reduce gun violence, not just interpersonal violence, they also reduce violence when it comes to interactions with police officers. You know, it's always interesting to note that in communities where, you know, quote unquote constitutional carry, or rather, you know, unlicensed public carry is permitted, you know, police officers also suffer some of the gun violence experienced in those communities. So it happens in every direction. And so when we talk about those kinds of policies, I think we always have to look to the social science, and there is a good amount of research, although I will say it's relatively recent, since it was very difficult to study gun violence for a very long time, thanks to federal law. But the research that's coming out now demonstrates that a variety of policies can be effective at reducing gun violence. When we talk about, what's another one so when we talk about the federal assault weapons ban, we saw a reduction in mass violence that was incredibly tremendous. And the number's not coming to me off the top of my head, but it was very, very high. And so we know, particularly, that policy is useful for studying, right? Because it started and ended. And so we have the before, the during, and the after, and we can understand that the policy was incredibly effective for what it was intended to do, which was reducing violence, and particularly mass violence. But it's really about the collection of policies, and not any one particular policy at this juncture, given the current state of the Second Amendment, that's going to be helpful at reducing gun violence in communities across the country.
And Esther, while I have you, before I open it up I want to ask a question of everybody on the panel. In 2022, I believe it was June, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 vote with, I think it was Clarence Thomas who wrote the opinion, issued a decision in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. We were going to talk about Bruin, the superintendent of the New York State Police, which struck down a century-old state law that restricted carrying firearms in public. Talk a little bit about that case, the decision, and its implication on gun control policies and strategies.
Sure. So Bruin is a really interesting case, but I think it merits, like, this conversation merits going back a little bit further, which is that basically the Second Amendment, as an individual constitutional right, was not recognized or understood that way until 2008. It basically sprung out of the ground in 2008 with an opinion by Justice Scalia in DC versus Heller. Following Heller, the lower courts sort of coalesced around a particular methodology for evaluating challenges under the Second Amendment. They used the tools that they use in other constitutional spaces to determine whether a particular gun safety law was constitutional. That methodology is called means-end balancing, tiers of scrutiny. That's what Rudy Giuliani couldn't remember in front of a judge when he was asked, the regular kind. I don't know if anyone recalls that anecdote, but anyway, so the courts used tiers of scrutiny to evaluate challenges under the Second Amendment. It's a methodology that they're comfortable with because they use it in other constitutional spaces. What happened in Bruin, and I think it's worth noting that Bruin issued the day before Dobbs issued, they did a very similar thing. They basically got rid of all of this case law that had been applying the Second Amendment in the way that we look at other constitutional rights. And they got rid of it, and they said, now we have to look to text, history, and tradition to understand whether a law is constitutional. This methodology is problematic for a lot of different reasons. And I think that the way that the lower courts have been dealing with it is sort of proof of how unworkable it is as a methodology. But basically, it tells lower courts that in order to consider a challenge, first they have to understand whether the proposed conduct of the challenger is protected by the plain text, in quotes, plain text of the Second Amendment, which is very interesting verbiage, given that the Second Amendment, which has been interpreted by the courts to protect a right to carry firearms for self-defense. Self-defense does not appear in the text of the Second Amendment, so that's a pretty uncomfortable starting place for this methodology. But so if it's covered by the plain text of the Second Amendment, it's presumptively unconstitutional. And it is the government's burden to put on examples of the historical tradition of laws regulating firearms in this country to show that the modern law is analogous to historical laws. And not just any historical laws. The court didn't really give us a ton of guidance for what kind of historical laws, but it pointed out that a lot of different kinds of historical laws were not going to be relevant, and that the most relevant time period was around the ratification of the Second Amendment and also around Reconstruction, probably, although they left that a bit open-ended. And in applying this methodology in that particular case, they found that New York's one particular feature of New York's public carry regime was unconstitutional. I think it's worth mentioning, and when we talk about this case, the methodology comes to mind, and is such a massive shift in law that I think we lose track of the fact that the decision was actually relatively narrow, that it was only one particular feature of New York's law, that a lot of other laws were upheld pretty explicitly by the court's decision. But that's not to say that this case hasn't had an effect on the lower courts. It has had a tremendous effect on the lower courts. And I think that the state of the current Second Amendment law could be described as unpredictable, volatile. I think that the lower courts are really struggling to apply this test. We've had really idiosyncratic results of challenges of the same laws across the country at various court levels. We're seeing circuit splits appear across the country. We're also seeing intra-circuit splits. It's just been complete chaos. And so what's going to be interesting about the upcoming Supreme Court case, United States versus Rahimi, which is considering a challenge to 922G8, with the federal domestic violence restraining order prohibitor that prevents anyone subject to such a restraining order from possessing firearms under federal law. It'll be really interesting to see how they arrive at their decision and what parts of the Bruin methodology they end up clarifying. You're right that Justice Thomas issued the decision last time. There were concurrences by a number of justices. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh issued a joint concurrence where they reiterated some parts in Heller that seemed to temper the Bruin decision. Justice Barrett, who I think is probably itching to write an opinion on this subject, issued a concurrence where she pointed out some of the gaps in the majority opinion and some of the unanswered questions there. Justice Alito jumped in with some, in my mind, offensive sort of descriptions of how we should be ignoring the current state of the gun violence epidemic, in applying the court's new methodology. But just to say, the current state of the Second Amendment is pretty unpredictable. And I think that as a practical matter, what's happened is that legislatures have, sort of experienced a chilling as a result of that unpredictability. But ultimately, when I read Bruin, and this is why I think it's worth noting that the decision was ultimately really narrow, I think that the justices really contemplated a world where the majority of the gun safety laws that are on the books will survive, and giving legislators space to continue to legislate firearm possession, firearm sales, and a lot of different, pieces of gun violence prevention regulation. But the way that they sort of, double down on their Bruin methodology, and to the extent, the extent to which they double down on sort of the complicated to apply pieces of it, I think will have a massive effect on how comfortable legislators feel moving forward. I think that the other piece that bears mentioning here, and I'm going to stop now because I realize that we need to leave some time for questions. The gun industry.
We do indeed. You have a chance to finish because
I have two sentences. The gun industry is incredibly well funded and incredibly litigious. And so when we talk about local legislation, and particularly local legislation, but also at the statewide level, legislators know, and their city attorneys and their state's attorneys know that they're going to have to respond to challenges under the Second Amendment, because the gun industry is going to bring them, whether they're meritorious or not. And so that just makes it cost to pass these laws in a way that also creates its own chilling effect. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I want to be mindful of time. I want to make sure that the people who have joined us have a chance to get their questions in. So I have one final question. I have more than that, but I'm going to stop it there. And that's for Jennifer. Jennifer, as a journalist, how realistic is it to think that with the proliferation of guns on the street, in the hands of extremists and others who want to do harm, that gun violence can be reduced?
Gun violence can be reduced in certain places in the country.
Because Karen said there's more guns than people.
There's more guns, and we're the only country where that is true. And so we're a global outlier, and it's obvious to see why. There are targeted interventions that reduce community gun violence, as we heard in other panels. There's, California has a lot of shootings. It also has a lot of population. Its rate of gun violence is somewhere in the middle. It's not at the top. It's on the lower side. The states with the lowest amount of guns and the strictest laws have the lowest rate of gun death. New York, Massachusetts, all the permit to purchase states. So it is possible to reduce gun violence in certain states. Guns are durable products, and they are consumer products. They're durable. They last 100 years. I mean, I don't know many people who have a gun from 1905 in the glove compartment, but guns that are around, were around 50 years ago, they'll be around around us for 50 more years. If we stopped all gun sales today, we would still have gun violence for decades to come, because there are just so many guns, and you can have very strict laws, but your laws are only as strong as the laws of the states surrounding you, because you can just drive guns in from other states. That's where the Northeast, when it has gun violence, a lot of their guns come from the South, which have very permissive gun laws. So it's probably, I'll be honest, not going to be solved in my lifetime, but it will eventually, when the country decides it's had enough, and it becomes culturally taboo to allow the nearly unfettered proliferation of guns in the civilian marketplace.
Great, thank you. Are there questions we can take?
Well, can I just respond for sorry.
Like for 30 seconds.
That's all. 30 seconds is fine. So yes, America has a gun problem, but I want to stress that each state has a very different gun problem. There are states in the United States that have gun death rates that approach those of our European counterparts. We all have the same US Constitution. And so different states can adopt effective strategies. They do exist. They exist here and now in our lifetime. And that gives me hope, and is why I'm here. So that's what I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you for sticking to that 30 seconds. Carrie, the only reason I called you Rebecca is because her name is right below me. So I'll take some questions. Nikki says there are more guns than people, right? What specific financial and legislative measures can be scrutinized to uncover their impact on gun violence? And how can this information be used to advocate for more effective policies? Whoever wants to take it.
Look, if I could enact one policy like today, it would be a universal, no exception, secure storage, right? And there's another question in the chat about, do we have a national consensus around that? I don't think we do. But if I could pick one law, it would be that. And that deals with the volume of guns. It also deals with where those guns are and who has access to them. And when I think about the number and kind of gun death and injury that could be prevented by simply securing a gun, it's huge, and it's an evidence-based policy. And I also think of ERPOs as a form of secure storage. It's just involuntary secure storage where the state says we need to secure this weapon from you for some reason. And so in terms of there are more guns than people, I think that's fine. Just put them all in the same gun safe. It would prevent suicide, homicide, mass shootings, unintentional shootings, and homicide, because many of the weapons used in illegal homicide come from stolen weapons because those guns were not properly secured. It just has like a huge domino effect that is positive.
Rachel's question, she says, realistically speaking, with the mood of the courts and of Congress, how likely are any of these legal strategies likely to survive? Chris, you want to take that? I have no pressure, Chris.
So I mean, I should say I am by no means an expert on Second Amendment law generally. You know, I will say that we never actually got to the point of litigating the question, but we were optimistic that a Bruin challenge to our case would fail. And sort of, you know, Esther talked about the two-step process. I think what is effectively started to be analyzed as a two-step process under Bruin. And what started to develop, and again, it's been a while since I was really paying attention to these cases, but what we sort of saw was in the gun retail space, the gun commerce space, a line of lower court decisions basically saying that the first step is the conduct at issue within the plain text of the Second Amendment. So what does that say? Keep and bear arms, right? It doesn't talk about the manufacture of firearms. It doesn't talk about the sale of firearms. You know, potentially at some extreme, you know, no one's allowed to manufacture a gun in America. No one's allowed to sell one. Maybe it touches on the plain text of the Second Amendment, but you know, we started to see kind of a line of cases finding that kind of conduct was not in the plain text of the Second Amendment, and therefore the sort of historical tradition side of it, which is, I think in a lot of ways very flexible, you know, maybe allows you to find what you want to find in the historical record. You didn't even really get there. And particularly when you're talking about a specific manufacturer, a specific dealer, like were their practices legal, responsible? In our case, for example, well, if you can't buy ghost guns, you can go to a licensed gun seller, undergo a background check pursuant to the Gun Control Act, and ultimately have a firearm. So what really is the restriction of the protected constitutional right?
Thank you. Gloria says the CDC looked at gun violence as a health issue, but this policy was ended and unfunded under a former administration. So her question is this. She says the data was invaluable. What can we do to reinstate this CDC work and policy? Anybody want to jump in?
I think they're talking about the prohibition on research that supported gun control, which was a policy in the CDC for decades, almost 2 decades, and that was eliminated. And we have had an explosion of publicly funded and privately funded gun violence research, and those studies are just starting to come in, and they're really showing what we've all known. You know, more guns equals more shootings. So that has started, and I'm very eager to see in the next 5 to 10 years what these studies, find.
So do you think this stuff is going to be reinstated?
Well, it was actually.
It was, okay.
That was a
At least some of it was.
budgetary rider. Yeah, that was finally eliminated after the series of catastrophic mass shootings we had in the last decade.
Yeah. And Cassie wants to know what the data says about the effectiveness of ERPO laws. Who's my ERPO expert?
So what I will say is ERPO laws, again, are relatively new in terms of, their proliferation, and research takes a while to be able to see effects. Like there are very few gun laws that are enacted and have an immediate effect, especially something like ERPO laws, which requires implementation across a lot of actors, including the courts. Again, what ERPO law research that I've seen tends to say is that these orders are targeted appropriately. That is, the people that have ERPOs filed in concern about them they're not frivolous. It's not someone just seeking revenge behavior, trying to take away someone's gun. It is because there is a concern that that person is an imminent danger to themselves and others. And we have seen that they have been effective in reducing suicide and public shooting events that could result in mass casualties. It's also very hard to know exactly how many deaths you avert from, a mass shooting. That's counterfactuals are hard. So I am optimistic about ERPOs. But I think there's just still a lot we don't know about them. To Jennifer's point, the NIJ is releasing a new call of ERPO-related funding. They're sort of rolling out now. So it's the CDC, it's the NIH, it's the NIJ. This funding is coming from lots of different parts of the federal government. And so not only has the Dickey Amendment been lifted from the CDC, it's really affecting lots of parts of government funding.
Right, thank you. And the final question, final question comes from Rachel. How does the fact that policies are usually in response to a tiny percentage of homicides, mass shootings, how does that impact their effectiveness when it comes to actually addressing gun violence? Esther, you want to take that one and condense it?
Sure. I will say that definitely mass violence sort of brings our gun violence epidemic into the conversation in a way that the daily violence that a lot of communities experience will not. That's not to say, however, that sometimes our responses to mass violence only include policies to address mass violence. I think that Jennifer might have been talking about, or actually I think it was Carrie talking about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I think that, mass violence sort of brought that to everyone's mind. And I think probably was a big reason that it ended up passing in the way that it did. But the policies aren't necessarily focused on addressing just mass violence. And so I think it's important that we, not sort of discount the progress that we make in response to mass violence, because it does have effect on daily violence in our country. But also knowing that responsive action, for example, the bump stock rule issued by ATF in response to the shooting in Las Vegas, those policies are also important. Just because we need to address more than mass violence doesn't mean that we shouldn't be also addressing mass violence. So I think it's all around.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks to our 4 panelists. You guys were amazing. Thanks to the participants for joining us. And here's hoping that the conversation continues.